Well, there you go. This gospel just screams Happy Valentine's Day, doesn't it? What was the lectionary folks thinking? They're making this hard. Then you say the gospel of the Lord after that. You know, I mean, there's so much to deal with there. There's so many verses. Really, there's too much to deal with. And so I think I'm going to throw something out. We're going to acknowledge first that I think there's something that we all are engaged with in this passage in a different way. It strikes us, hits us in other ways. And I would certainly be available to have conversation with you about that, and Phil would as well, about particulars of that. What I think for us in these next few moments that would be most helpful is to look at this passage as a whole, about the whole story that Jesus is unfolding here as he's talking with his disciples. This greater narrative about what it means to be part of the life of a disciple. We're in the midst of several weeks here in a row, all from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I think this is week 3 of like 6 or 7 weeks in a row. All the passages just come one after another. Remember 2 weeks ago, we heard the Beatitudes, where Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek, the mourning, those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are those folks." And then, remember last week, intern Paul read those declarative words from Jesus. You are salt. You are light. This is your identity. Remember, that's the preface. These 2 weeks both have powerful declarative statements about who you are. And then, the next words out of Jesus' mouth are these. From Matthew. See, we cannot and should not read Matthew in a vacuum without hearing these words of promise and relationship that come right before them. I think too often in our world, the view and the understanding, the view of religion, people have this tendency to reduce the Christian life to a series of checklists. Things you should do. And then it ends up how pious or how moral you are that connects you with life in God. And I think looking at religion in that way is why an increasingly large number of people are saying, I'm spiritual, not religious. Because they think if that's what religion is, that doesn't ring true for me in my experience. That doesn't always seem to make sense and compute. I think that's why we hear that more often now than before. I started this group just this past week called a flash mob. I don't know if you know what that is, but a flash mob is a group that comes together for a common purpose. And the coordination, the when and the where, is all done through technology, text message, internet, emailing, Facebook. So I did this. I sent this out to like 20 people. 12 people showed up, young adults, young people, because I looked around the table with the exception of one person. I was the oldest person around the table, I think. But 12 folks showed up to come and to talk about what does it mean to be Christian in a culture that is more spiritual than it is religious? What does that mean for us? Why be a Christian? What difference does that make in my life? And it was a fascinating discussion. But even above that, the coolest thing was there was connections. There was community being made among these people, most of them that had never met one another and loosely connected with this place now. There was community there. One of the things that we talked about that I think applies to the passages for today is that faith is not seen as just this point where you arrive there and then suddenly you're there. We talked about that faith is more of a road or a journey that we are always on. And I think that part of that is exactly what Jesus is telling his disciples in this sermon. He's saying, look, I'm getting you ready to go out. You're going to meet all kinds of new people. Remember, this is who you are. This is what you are called to be about. He brings all of that in there. Jesus, he's also addressing the understanding of the old law. And by old, I don't mean broken or passé. But the law had been misunderstood by the scribes and the Pharisees in his context. The law was intended the point, the intent of the law was to establish promise, to establish connection with God, and then to establish relationship. You are salt. You are blessed. You are light. That is our identity. That is who we are. And then the reign of God, or living into the kingdom, becomes the way that we live into that relationship that we have with God. Jesus says several times, you've heard it said that X, but I say to you this. Jesus, he's kind of upping the ante, so to speak, because he's saying this way of living is about a bigger vision. It's about a deeper sense of life and hope that comes from our relationship with God that is our source of everything. That way of living, that sense of life is lived out in community, in relationship with one another. The relationship that God has with us is lived out in the way that we live for the sake of others and with others in community. See, God promises this relationship, calls us blessed, and then that gift is mirrored with the way we are salt or light for the kingdom in the community of God. I was in Starbucks this past week, as I am pretty much every day now. Sitting there, I think it was on Thursday, the snow and ice was starting to melt. The sun was out, but it was still below freezing. And there were, everyone and their dog was there getting a hot drink, I think. There wasn't a table, there wasn't a seat to be found in this one right over here. But I sat down as this guy was getting up, and I was working there. And I worked for a while, and this fellow walked in and was talking on the phone. I could tell he was talking with his business partner. And he was saying, I know we're supposed to meet here, but I don't see any open seats anywhere. I don't know if we can do this. And I was just about done, so I waved him over and said, here, take my seat. I'm getting up anyway. So I started this conversation with him, and he said, I said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm in the software business. He said, how about you? I said, well, I'm a pastor at Calvary Lutheran Church right down the road. I'm just out and about today. I'm reading the gospel for this Sunday. And he said, it's funny that I ran into you. He said, I'm going to meet my business partner here, and he and I are going to have a discussion because we've decided we need in our business to give back a little bit. He said, I have all these networks of people. He said, I'm in front of people every day. I have relationships like you wouldn't believe, connections. And he and I decided it was time that we use that to give back for the sake of this gospel. And it occurred to me, I was just like, I think that's what Jesus is talking about. A different way of living in relationship, seeing things differently, and the connections and the difference that can be made in the community. I think he had it. I think that's what Christ is talking about. I don't know how these passages hit you. It's easy to be hit in several ways. It's easy to be convicted. It's easy to want to be more religious. It's easy to look at it and say, that's why I'm more spiritual than I am religious. However that hits you, the good news is the same. Good news comes from God's words in Deuteronomy, that God has set before us what? Life and death. And because of that relationship, that promise of life, that relationship we have with God, we can choose life and hope that comes through Christ. We can choose life from the strength and nourishment that we get at God's table, being fed with bread and wine, a moment with God. We choose life because we see it in this community. I see it. You see it here. That's why we're here. We have that chance to choose life because of that opportunity. Paul says in that reading to the Corinthians, some water, some plant, but guess what? They all do the work of God. God does the growing, but we all work together in community, one, common in purpose, in relationship. That means something for us. in moments where we're struggling, in moments where even things in ministry here can become heated just because we're so passionate. We're so excited because we care what we do. Even in moments where we try to be religious. Even moments where we try to be more spiritual than we are religious. In those moments, God enters in the midst of us, calling us to be about a deep relationship of commitment that happens in this community. Living out, living into a new way, making a difference for the kingdom. God says this is our identity, to share life and hope that we know that comes from walking with Christ. Thanks be to God for that gift of relationship. Amen.